it's Lucy Litch, and this is Tiny House Conversations. It's the Australian-based podcast where I interview experienced tiny houses, tiny builders, and adventurers in the tiny world so you can discover how to create, build, and transition into tiny life. Before we get into today's Tiny House conversation, I want to tell you about something exciting coming up in November 2022. It's a free 3-day online Tiny House Summit created by Ethan Waldman, the host of the Tiny House Lifestyle podcast and author of the guide Tiny House Decisions. Ethan was a guest on my show in episode 25, as well as featured in episode 26. And guess what? I'm going to be a guest speaker at the summit, talking with Ethan all about tiny houses in Australia. The summit will also feature many different tiny house folks from around the world talking about all the different topics you want to know more about, including composting toilets, trailers, solar systems, tiny house design, building science, renting out your tiny house for short and long-term stays, how to get out of debt and start saving for a tiny house, and plenty more. So if you're a curious tiny houser who's deciding if this way of life is for you and you want to learn more about tiny houses, or if you're already a tiny houser and you love being part of as many tiny house events as you can, I'd love to see you there. To register for the summit for free and reserve your space, just head over to tinyhousesummit.co. That's tinyhousesummit.co or .co. I can't wait to see you there. Now on to the show. Welcome back to Tiny House Conversations. Joining me on the show today is Zara D'Cotta, who is a building biology new build consultant, a keynote speaker, and founder of The Healthy Home. Zara discovered her passion for environmental health after going through cancer. Through her own experiences with environmental illness, including 4 years on the move from one unhealthy home to the next, and extensive research, Zara realized unhealthy homes are making us sick. She's been on a mission to help families make informed choices ever since. After experiencing mould symptoms in more homes than she could count, Zara woke up after her first night in a newly built home with stinging eyes and experienced other symptoms during her first months in her new home. It was at this point she realized new builds can contribute to health problems too, and decided to learn all she could about home design and building materials so she can one day build her own healthy home and play what part she can changing the way homes are designed and built. Zara has spent the past 3 years studying building biology with a specific focus on healthy home design and building materials in Australia and the USA. And in this conversation, we talk about the different types of chemicals contained in building materials and how they can be detrimental to health, how to determine whether a building material is safe to use when it comes to the impacts on your health and the environment. We also talked about why reclaimed and recycled building materials are not always the healthiest choice, the limitations with the building codes when it comes to building materials and health, how to reduce exposure to chemicals and off-gassing in your tiny home, and so much more. This was a super informative episode, and it's a conversation I feel needs to be talked about more in the tiny house world. So onto this tiny house conversation with Zara. Zara, welcome to Tiny House Conversations. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Lucy. I'm very excited to be here.
So, Zara, you are a building biology new build consultant, and you're also the founder of The Healthy Home. And, I know for me, being in the wellness space for over 10 years now, that health is not just about good nutrition and regular movement and healthy sleep, although those factors are obviously important. But another factor that's super important is the home environment that we live in. And it's, extremely important for our physical, our mental and emotional health. And whether it's looking at things like air quality or exposure to mold or electromagnetic fields from our devices or chemicals in cleaning products, in building materials and so much more. And, all of these things fall into that area of building biology, which we've been speaking about on the podcast in previous episodes, and we'll be talking a lot more about it, different topics in building biology in upcoming episodes too. But if you're listening to us at home and you want to know more about mold prevention for your tiny home and just get a basic understanding of building biology, You can check out episode number 28 with naturopath and mould specialist Amy Skilton, as well as episode number 32 on reducing electromagnetic fields, which is also with Amy. But Zara, today with you, I would love to focus on natural building materials. So talk about why that's so important to consider, about the chemicals in conventional building materials. But first, I'd love if you're able to start by just sharing a bit about your story and your background and how you came to be doing what you do today with the healthy home and the work that you do.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Lucy. And I just want to give credit to you for giving such focus to this really important topic in the world of building biology. I think it's amazing. I hate using the word journey, but it has been, started 9.5 years ago with my first cancer diagnosis at age 29. I had breast cancer. Went to a wellness retreat after my radiotherapy, learned all the things I felt that I needed to learn as a result of my cancer experience, got rid of toxic cleaning and personal care products, switched to organic food, learned to meditate, left my corporate career. And, came out of that experience feeling very grateful for everything that experience had taught me. And then 2 years to the day later, I was diagnosed with a melanoma and had to have surgery. And thankfully in both situations, the margins were clear and my cancer hadn't spread. But after that experience, I lost a very close friend to cancer shortly after. And cancer had never made me sick. I hadn't had to go through chemotherapy or anything like that, but I had about 20 plus symptoms that none of my medical specialists were able to diagnose or attribute to anything specific. So at that point, I decided I really wanted to kind of look more into the genetic side of things and try to get to the bottom of what was going on. And I was very fortunate to come across an environmentally aware naturopath who did the longest health history anyone had ever done. Spent an hour and a half asking about every building I'd ever lived in, every symptom I'd ever experienced from the day I was born. And I found out that I'm one of the 1 in 4 people that's genetically susceptible to mould. And I probably had a degree of sensitivity all my life, but my cancer treatments and 2 years of very stressful life events had put me on the extreme end of the scale in terms of sensitivity. And I was told that for the rest of my life, anytime I wanted to move, I would need to get a building biologist to assess my home, which I thought was pretty far-fetched. Mm-hmm. A building biologist came to assess my home in Melbourne and said he didn't think it was going to be best for me long-term and I'd be better somewhere the weather is warmer. So I moved from Melbourne to Sydney, like one of the mouldiest cities in Australia, and ended up spending 4 years on the move from one mouldy house to the next before eventually deciding to move into a brand new build in northern New South Wales and thinking this was going to be the key to getting my health back on track. And I woke up after the first night in my new home with stinging eyes. They were stinging so severely I had to get out of the house while I let fresh air in. I had a rash for the first few months and bouts of nausea. And it was at this point I decided I needed to learn everything there is to learn about the health and environmental impacts of building materials and home design so that I can one day build my own healthy home and do what I can to be part of the movement for change in the meantime. So that led to my studies in building biology and to me being here today.
Wow, what a journey you've had. I thank you so much for sharing all of that. And it sounds like you've kind of turned I guess something that you're experiencing that is not such, a positive thing into, helping other people avoid things like that and really sort of, it reminds me a little bit of like Amy. I know that you're friends with Amy, like, going through all these health challenges to then coming out on the other side and then doing, educating yourself as much as possible and then helping people as well. And so I think that's really inspiring. And I love hearing that. And I'm also sorry to hear about your friend as well. And it is, it's a tricky thing. And there are so many things in our modern environment today that can really impact our health, especially like we're talking about today with the built environment. And so just before I mentioned that you're a building biology new build consultant and you were talking about moving into a new build as well. So I'm curious, just for anyone listening that might not be familiar with what that is and what you do or what they do, are you able to just give us a little bit of an overview of that?
Yeah, so the focus of my studies is specifically on various aspects of home design and building materials. So, design and materials to prevent condensation and mold, reduce EMF levels inside the home, looking at the health impacts of building materials, really just scratching the surface of what it explores on a much deeper level. So, that's the focus of what I do rather than a building biologist who goes and assesses homes when your home is making you sick.
Okay, that makes sense. And I know that on one of your, I think it's on your Instagram page, or it could be like on your website or something, I saw this quote that, or this piece of writing that you wrote, and I thought it was really, I don't know, it just summed things up so well. And it was that building or renovating your home is possibly the biggest investment that you'll make, yet homeowners often get caught up thinking about what their home will look like in choosing colors and textures, but don't consider the health or environmental impacts of the materials and whether they're suited to the climate and the microclimate of the home. I'm wondering if you're able to just go a bit more into that, because I think it's a really important sentiment to highlight in this conversation today.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm all for creating a vision board. I was interested in working on my own yesterday because building or renovating your home is a really exciting thing, and casting that vision is such an important part of bringing it to life. But I think we need to go back to the reason that we build a home in the first place, which is to meet our most basic human needs. So if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, down at the bottom of the pyramid is shelter, a safe place to sleep, for our bodies to rest and repair. We need clean water to drink and bathe in, and clean air to breathe. And then right at the top of the pyramid, there's esteem and self-actualization. Yet often when a home is designed, it's aesthetics that are the first consideration, with very little thought given to how well the home is going to support the well-being of the people that live in it. And the most important, the most critical first step in creating a healthy home that is overlooked in the majority of modern builds is assessing the site that your home is going to be built on. Now, I know in the context of a tiny home, this might be a bit different because you're potentially going to be moving it around, but something that's really important is, what is the topography of the site? Is it subject to flooding and rising sea levels? Where does the sun rise and fall? Where do the prevailing winds come from? Are there any nearby health hazards? What is the structure of the soil? Are there geopathic stress lines? All these sorts of things should inform where on the block of land the home is built, what type of foundation you choose, where the windows and doors are going to be placed, passive heating, cooling, and ventilation, what type of materials you choose, because no two sites are the same, and trying to create a healthy home with a one-size-fits-all approach, I often say, is probably going to end in tears.
Yeah, there's definitely so many variables for sure. And you mentioned new builds, or we've talked about a little bit. I think that like you moved into a new build, and then that's kind of what you're focusing on as well. I feel like there's potentially a perception around like a new build maybe not being as likely to have, whether it's mold or other unhealthy aspects to it, than an older build. But you're able to talk like a little bit more about that and how that might not necessarily be the case.
Yeah, it actually was one of the first assignments that I did that really opened my eyes to this. I had to assess every single building material used for the interior and exterior of my home, and I had to research and reference the known health and environmental impacts of every ingredient in every material. And I was literally at my desk for weeks researching PubMed, the world's leading peer-reviewed medical database, and I just couldn't believe the mountains of evidence about the known health impacts of, I would say, 95% of the materials used in my home, from carpets, flooring, subfloors, cabinetry, bench tops, the walls, the insulation. Pretty much everything had ingredients that were known to be carcinogenic, hormone disrupting. Formaldehyde is a really common chemical in a lot of building materials, and it's a known group 1 carcinogen. And what actually I find really interesting is that they seem much more onto this overseas than we are in Australia. So back in 2008, when Hurricane Katrina happened, there were thousands of FEMA trailers given to the survivors that had to actually be abandoned because of high levels of formaldehyde in low quality engineered wood products. And people experienced symptoms like chest tightness, rashes, nausea. and stinging eyes. And they later found out that the makers of the trailers knew that formaldehyde was at a dangerous level. So I really hope that we reach a point here in Australia where better choices aren't having to be driven by the homeowner, that it becomes the norm. The other one is VOCs, which are commonly found in paints, building materials, carpets, furniture as well. And in China, at the end of 2019, the South China Morning Post reported that 70% of children in the Children's Oncology ward came from homes that had recently been renovated. So again, an example of another country that seems much more clued into the impacts that materials in new builds are having on the health of the occupants. When the home is built, when it's newly built, is when the levels are at their highest. They will diminish over time, but it can take years for some of those materials to outgas.
Yeah, and I think also, I feel like, I don't know if maybe this applies as much to building materials as it does to maybe, like, you're talking about EMFs and stuff, as well as like there is this like advancement in this mindset of becoming so advanced with our technology and things that we're doing. And so then we're seeing like new homes have all these, like, all the devices and the appliances and everything's a smart thing and a wireless this and a, you know, and so that's like another aspect to think about it as well. That, like, so sometimes I think that sometimes it's better to be a bit old school, but of course it depends on the context, as you say, because so many of the materials that are going into building these homes and constructing these homes are very questionable. And you just mentioned there, so formaldehyde, and then you also mentioned VOC. So for anyone that is not familiar what a VOC is, it stands for volatile organic compounds. Are you able to go into like maybe some more of the different types of chemicals that we might find in the conventional building materials, and then what sources would they be found in?
So another one is polyurethane. So polyurethane is often used in floor finishes. It's highly toxic, and building biologists have found it can make people really sick. There's solvents and surfactants in paints. And the other thing is that often paints are labelled as low VOC, but our standards in Australia are very different to Europe and California, for example. A paint can be labelled low VOC in Australia if it's less than 50 grams of VOCs per litre, but the European standard is 10. It also doesn't take semi-VOCs into account, so that can include fungicides. So you might have a paint that's low VOC but have like antimicrobials in it, which are known to have various health impacts. And, you know, I've seen paints that are labelled sensitive choice and have the Asthma Foundation logo but have ingredients in them that are known respiratory irritants. And if you see a paint that's got that says it prevents mould or it treats mould, then that should set alarm bells ringing, because the way that you prevent mould is by preventing moisture becoming a problem, and you don't want to choose a paint. We can get into this with some of the other chat about building materials, but the other important consideration is whether a material, the paint, is vapor permeable. So you want water vapor to be able to pass through it so it doesn't contribute to mould.
It's like it reminds me of the labeling when it comes to our food and even the beauty products and personal care and cleaning products, that you can't always trust what the marketing says on the front. And if you look at, like, you really want to know exactly what the ingredients are. And if you don't know what those ingredients are, I mean, it's really important to question that. And yeah, because I've definitely seen, I know going through my own tiny house design and build it, I ended up I did a lot of research on natural paints and stuff like that. And I came across a lot of the ones like what you're talking about, where it says that it's low VOC, but then I also find that some suppliers won't even specify their specific ingredients. And for me, when I see that, I also think that's a bit of a red flag, whereas others will, you know, happily put exactly what these contain in them. So it's like it's a bit of a minefield. Like, there's so many things to consider. And I'm wondering, because I know that in tiny homes, not everyone does this, but it can be common as well to see carpet in tiny homes. And I'm curious about what you think about carpet when it comes to, and what could potentially be contained in carpet in terms of the chemicals.
Yeah, so carpet, there's synthetic dyes, there's formaldehyde, often like the underlays made from polyurethane, there's the glues, but also carpet generally from an indoor air quality point of view. There's carpet where I live upstairs, and to be honest, if I could, I'm in a rental, I'd rip it out if I could, just because of I heard a great analogy that having carpet is like gluing your bed sheet to the floor and never being able to wash it.
Oh, no.
Because it traps so much. Think of everything that ends up in carpet: dust, mold spores, pet dander, pesticides, that even with, the best HEPA filter vacuum cleaner and cleaning every week is never going to get rid of it all. And I've actually had clients that have been unwell that have removed their carpets and noticed an immediate improvement in symptoms. And even one of them noticed that the dehumidifier was collecting far less moisture because the carpet just must have been holding on to so much moisture.
Oh, wow.
Particularly if anyone in the home does have allergies or sensitivities, I would definitely suggest avoiding carpets.
Yeah, that's what I've kind of tried to avoid them for a really long time. And I definitely made sure I was like, I don't want to have that in my tiny. What about things like heavy metals and flame retardants and stuff like that, whether it's in the building materials or other things in the home?
Yes, flame retardants and heavy metals are definitely among a number of various contributors to poor indoor air quality in new builds.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. There's so many things. Like I sometimes I wonder, like, how did we get here?
I know.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting? So this is just a side note that I just thought of as we're talking. I went to the building company to see, I was just telling you when we were offline that my tiny build is at the very end stages, and I went in to see how it's all going. And I've asked them to use natural exterior timber oil on some of the cladding of the cedar on the outside of the tiny home, as well as on my timber bench and timber stairs. Mm-hmm. And using that natural oil, like, they were actually really amazed at how much more beautiful and how much more it brought out the natural graininess of the timber. And it's so much so that they're like considering how they can incorporate into their builds. And I think it's like we've gone so far the other way of just accepting. I mean, there's so many chemicals in our environment, whether it's the food and obviously we're talking about the building materials and also other places in our environment. And like, it just goes to show, using just with that example, like using a natural product. Even though I think it was hard for me to avoid like the treated timber, unfortunately, but at least using that natural oil really, like, it responded really well to the material.
Yeah, and I love that story, and just want to give credit to you because that's such an amazing and powerful example of the ripple effect that you've created by asking for the better products in your build. And that's what I'm so proud of the residential clients that I work with that are, asking for the better products, and then the builders that they're working with then, being open to the better options as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a matter of education as well, like, because the more that we can talk about it and the more that, like, have conversations like you and I are today, and also you're educating people about this in a really meaningful way, that, we just got to keep doing it, because I think it really is. We're not getting that in sort of mainstream circles, that education. And, speaking of, we're talking about moisture and mold before. I know that when there are different chemicals in these building materials, that there can sort of be this interaction of when you have the chemicals in the building materials as well as the presence of moisture and mold. I'm wondering what you're able to share about that.
I live in a really humid climate, as you know, and I've actually just been reflecting ahead of our chat. This home's 3 years old. I hate to think how many VOCs my body's absorbed over the past couple of years. But so in essence, high humidity will accelerate off-gassing of VOCs, and moisture in building materials will cause chemicals to decompose, which again will lead to the release of VOCs. So if you are in a humid climate in a new build, then try and keep the moisture levels under control with a dehumidifier and ventilate as much as you can.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to say in relation to VOCs is that not all VOCs are bad. Humans emit VOCs, so do trees, so do pets, essential oils and food. So it's the synthetic ones that we want to minimize as much as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good differentiation to make. So a lot of my listeners, some are looking to DIY their tiny home. Some are going through tiny building companies. And I mean, even just from my own experience recently, it is really hard to have every single piece of your tiny home be completely natural because, you know, even as I just said before, like even if they're using natural timbers, they're often treated. And even though some builders will do like high level customization and allow you to supply your own materials or appliances or paints and fixtures and other items, because there's so many moving parts and layers to a home, and really, especially literally constructing it from the ground up. So it can be a little bit overwhelming to try and supply every little thing, and maybe might not necessarily be possible anyway, just because of like availability of sourcing and stuff. But if someone is going through the design stage of their tiny home with a building company, I'm curious if there maybe are a few questions or things that they can just prioritize and consider when it comes to the construction of their tiny home to minimize the exposure to these chemicals that we're talking about, whether it's things that they can do or questions that they can ask.
Yeah. So something I want to say is, and I think this is a big one for people at the moment, regardless of whether it's a tiny house, because rising materials costs, is to let go of the idea that every material that you put in your home is going to be perfect from a health point of view, and that so much can be achieved by getting the design right. And I've been loving seeing clients in my Build a Healthy Home community that are, you know, starting to bring their homes to life, and not all their choices, even like knowing what they know, having been through the course, they haven't been able to make all their perfect material choices, but they've been able to achieve so much by getting the design right and having plenty of sunlight and ventilation and reducing their EMF exposure. So if someone's in the design stage, I think from a materials point of view, you really want to be focusing on the materials with the largest surface area on the interior. So flooring and walls, and also the sleeping areas, because that's where your body's resting and repairing for 8 hours a day. And then having non-toxic paints and finishes. If you're looking at wood products, then looking at products that are EO rated, so they have lower formaldehyde emissions.
Yeah, it makes sense as well. So the places that you spend the most time, and then the places with the bigger surface area, that makes a lot of sense. And then obviously, like what you're saying, what they're finished with. And now for a quick break from this tiny house conversation. So I want to tell you about a wellness company whose products I've been using for many years, which I'll also have in my tiny house. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, or you know me personally, you'll know that health is super important to me. It's my number one value, and that includes a healthy home environment. And Block Blue Light are an amazing company who supply specialty downlights, light bulbs, reading lamps, blue blocking glasses, and much more to help protect you from exposure to artificial blue light and electromagnetic fields from your devices, lights, and other unnatural sources of lighting, especially at the wrong times of the day or night. Their products use amber and red lights rather than blue, think candle, moonlight, and fire vibes, which humans naturally would have been exposed to, especially in the evenings in our ancestral past. But the problem today is, in the modern world, the abundance of all the artificial sources of light on the blue spectrum from our devices, where we've managed to trick our natural rhythms and circadian biology to thinking that nighttime is daytime and daytime is nighttime. That means the blue light from your phone, computer, or other devices at night makes your body think that the sun is out, and therefore your physiology expresses itself as if it were daytime, which can lead to things like trouble falling asleep, interrupted sleep, or sleepless nights, as well as other health effects. And just like anything, the key is what else happens from this unnatural exposure over the long term. I love my Block Blue Light blue blocking glasses to wear during the day to work on my computer, as well as their light bulbs and twilight sleep lamps at night, and their twilight red light torch for camping weekends away. And in my tiny home, all my downlights are from Block Blue Light, which means I never have to worry about exposure to unnatural light. And for someone who has had challenges for several years, I absolutely notice a difference in sleep when I use my specialty blue blockers, lamps, and lights, which have been shown to support production of your sleep hormone melatonin for healthier sleep patterns. And if you haven't noticed, yes, I'm a nerd who goes to great lengths for my health. The good news is Block Blue Light are offering you 10% off your order when you use my unique link and code. Just head over to tinyhouseconversations.com/blue light and use the code THC podcast. THC is for Tiny House Conversations to get your discount. There's also a link in the episode show notes for your easy access. Now back to the show. And I know that, like, to determine whether a building material is safe to use, when it comes to the impacts on our health and the environment, I know that you have some different criteria that you use to kind of to navigate this. So I'm wondering if, when it comes to selecting building materials, when it comes to cladding, what are some considerations people can think about when choosing what's best for them and their needs and their context, and maybe thinking about, because timber and steel are often what people will use when they're DIY building, or building companies will do the same.
Yeah, sure. Good question. Yeah. So this is so often people come to me wanting to know what's the best choice, what's the healthiest, just tell me the best choice. But as you said, it so often comes down to context, budget, values, as I said before, the site, the climate, the microclimate. So there's 10 different criteria that I use to assess building materials based on their health and environmental impacts, so that people can make the decision about what feels right for them. So one of them is the material naturally occurring? So obviously both timber and metal are. Are they ecologically compatible? So that takes the entire life cycle of the material and its impact on the environment into consideration. And then there's energy consumption. So how much energy is required to grow it, extract it, transport it to site. And metal is obviously really high. That also needs to be considered against, it has a really long lifespan, which could then offset the embodied energy. The next one is thermal properties, which looks at the thermal conductivity of the material. So metal, for example, heats up and gets cold really quickly, which can lead to problems in the built environment. When warm air hits the cool surface, it contributes to condensation and mould, which can contribute to all sorts of problems in buildings. In the context of a wall system, theoretically, if the wall system is designed properly, you can use metal cladding. So you'd want to be making sure you have a ventilated cavity to make sure that any moisture that needs to migrate from the inside to the outside of the home doesn't condense when it hits the metal. The next consideration is how likely is it to off-gas toxic chemicals or radon gas. So that's another thing to bear in mind, is that a material might be natural, but granite, for example, is an example of a stone that can be high in radon gas. Hygroscopicity. So this looks at how well a material absorbs and releases moisture into the air. And this really helps regulate humidity. So timber is an example of a material that has an incredible ability to store and release large amounts of moisture because of its incredible hygrotic buffering capacity, whereas metal is not a material that is hygroscopic. There's absorption and diffusion properties. So a material that has good diffusion and absorption will actually help remove toxic chemicals and VOCs from the air. And again, timber is an example of a material that has the ability to absorb chemicals from the air. And then the next one is electrical properties. So is the material electrically conductive? And this is an instance. Metal is electrically conductive. So for this reason, metal cladding in the context of a wall system of a cladding material wouldn't be ideal, because it will actually exacerbate any electromagnetic field levels inside the home and pose a health risk to the occupants. So timber, from looking through the lens of this criteria, definitely rates much more highly than metal cladding.
Listening to you say all of that, there are so many moving parts, and I can see why it's not as easy to just say you should use this material because of this.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot to take in, but there are instances where, like I said before, context is everything. I wouldn't use metal cladding, but I would have a colorbond roof. But there's considerations that would need to be factored in to mitigate any potential impacts on the electroclimate.
Would you say that all these different considerations that you just mentioned, so they would also go for other parts of the home? So whether you are considering, flooring and internal walls and different other aspects of the home as well?
Yes. And so for each of those criteria, I give a score. There's a table that my clients can look at to see, okay, like on a scale of, is this terrible and it should be avoided, or is it kind of like avoid it if a better material is available, but otherwise, it's okay, or highly recommended. So just to really help guide the decision-making process.
Something else that is very common in DIY tiny house builds is that a lot of people are using recycled and reclaimed building materials, and often with the mindset of, okay, well, this is like good for the environment because I'm not going out and buying new materials. But I'm wondering if you're able to just let us know why that might not always be the healthier option.
Yeah, so I definitely encourage making use of what's locally available and recycling. I was actually on my family farm in Victoria recently, and it was amazing seeing an old converted barn, and they'd used lots of recycled timber. The thing to consider is that just because a material is recycled doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy. So recycled metal, again, like what context is it going to be used? I've heard about, innovation and recycling plastic to potentially use it to make bricks, but then that's going to impact whether water vapor is able to migrate through the material and potentially contribute to condensation and mold. If you're recycling timber, you want to make sure that it's not moldy.
It's context dependent as well. There's so many different things, but it's really great to know, because I think there is this consideration of the environment, but not necessarily the health effects of these materials. And another thing that people do in the tiny house world is often someone will buy a secondhand pre-loved tiny home. And so someone listening might already be living in their tiny, and they didn't really have the opportunity to go through the construction process and sort of be really mindful of all these different materials that they're using. Or maybe they just haven't considered this before. But what are some ways that people can reduce exposure to chemicals and off-gassing and things like that if they're already living in their tiny home and hadn't considered it before?
Yeah, so this, and as I've said before, this is, I fall into this category as well. And for me, it's just been about ventilate. Let as much fresh air in as you can. Consider an air purifier if it will fit with a medical grade HEPA filter. Heat recovery ventilation systems have really good filtration for VOCs on them as well. So really is all about ventilation. And also, if someone's already lived in it before them and, it's a couple of years old, it's definitely not going to be as bad as it was when it was first built.
Yeah. I'm wondering as well if maybe budget is something that is not too much of an issue for people. I'm wondering if it might even be worth getting a building biologist or something in to do a little bit of an inspection.
If they think that their home may be making them sick, that's definitely worth investigating. And the other thing to bear in mind is that chemical sensitivity, mold sensitivity, and EMF sensitivity can and actually do go hand in hand. So it can be difficult to pinpoint. Sometimes it's really obvious. I knew that when I've woken up, okay, my eyes are stinging. I know that it's, I know that it's likely chemicals in the air, but then there could be other things over time, like hormone imbalances or other kind of more subtle long-term health effects, and the causes might not be as obvious. And if you've got things like that going on, I wholeheartedly encourage people to work with a healthcare professional that's environmentally aware.
Yeah, for sure. And also those different things that you mentioned, so whether it's mold, EMFs, chemicals, they can often have similar symptoms, can't they? Or they can manifest in similar ways. And I know that I spoke about this with Amy on the mold podcast about how it's hard to know exactly is it this, is it this, is it this? But as you say, there will be some things that maybe seem more obvious than others. So yeah, definitely consulting a health professional. And I know something else that you often talk about is building codes and building materials. And, those codes are usually there for a reason, especially when it comes to safety. But obviously, with all that we've been talking about today, clearly there is a safety concern for health around the types of materials used to construct our homes. And are you able to just talk about maybe some of the limitations around those building codes when it comes to building materials?
Yeah, well, the Australian Building Code doesn't take into consideration the known health and environmental impacts of building materials, and which, as I alluded to, the mountain of evidence that I've found through my own studies it's quite hard to believe. And I was staggered to find that a 2018 study by the CSIRO across 40 universities found the highest ratios of formaldehyde, toluene, and xylenes, which are VOCs, in a green building. And they said that greater attention to indoor VOCs in new construction and renovated spaces and green buildings is needed. And then, as I said before, you look to there's the California Air Resources Board in Europe are enforcing policies to reduce VOC emissions, but Australia seems to be asleep on that front.
Yeah, and I think it goes for a lot of different things. I feel like, as I've had this similar conversations on the podcast about building codes and other aspects that it really doesn't take into account. And that's another one I think it talked about is like bushfire resilience and stuff. But again, it's a similar thing with these health issues when it comes to building codes. So I think it's really important to consider that and know that. And also, I mean, in the tiny house space, some builders are building to the building codes, but then more commonly, a lot of builders are building to the caravan codes because the tiny houses are on wheels. And I'm not exactly sure. Do you happen to know much about the caravan codes at all? Like, as in, I'm assuming it would probably be the same type of thing that they wouldn't take into account the health effects of what the tiny home is being built with. I would dare say that it probably doesn't, but I don't know if you've ever heard anything about that.
No, I haven't. I'd be very interested to hear if it did, but then you've got to wonder, at what point does it become a liability issue?
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. And that's a whole other thing to consider, and then insurance as well. And Zara, I know that you have got a couple of really amazing offerings for people when it comes to, healthy homes. So you've got a course called Build a Healthy Home. Are you able to just let us know a bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So the Build a Healthy Home e-course is for people that are embarking on their own renovation or build, and we explore everything you need to consider when assessing your site, coming up with your floor plan, designed to reduce EMF exposure, prevent condensation and mold. I've created all these checklists to take all the hard work out of it for you. And then we deep dive into building materials, interior and exterior. And this community started nearly 2 years ago. And it's amazing because I think probably the best part about it for the new people that come into the group is the connection with other like-minded home builders and actually seeing what decisions they've made with their knowledge from the course. And then for people who design or build homes, I've got the Healthy Building Materials Mastermind. And it happened really unexpectedly as a result of an architect going through the Build a Healthy Home e-course saying this building material stuff is information that everybody in the building industry needs to know. And again, the community of incredible building industry professionals that really care about building homes that are better for human health and the planet is something that really lights me up. We now have in-person gatherings in the Northern Rivers twice a year. So if anyone's wanting to find out more about that, there's details on thehealthyhome.com.au, and also feel free to reach out to me on Instagram. My handle's just Zara D'Cotta _thehealthyhome, and I've got a heap of other resources for people that just wanting to. I've got a Build a Healthy Home free ebook. I've got a Build a Healthy Home information pack for people that want to dive deeper. Lots of resources there.
I believe that you've also had a tiny house builder in your mastermind. Is that right?
Yes, Samuel. Uber tiny.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah, that's so good. We need more tiny house builders to be part of things like this. So if I'm just going to say it now, if you're listening to this at home and you're a tiny house builder, go and check out what Zara's doing, because this is really, really important. And I think we talked about this offline. It's not something that, builders and other professionals in the building industry are going to learn from. Kind of got to go and do that extra step of education yourself. So I will put a link in the show notes at tinyhouseconversations.com to all of your offerings and the places that people can find you. And I'm just wondering, as well, as we start to close out the conversation, Zara, is there anything that you feel like we haven't necessarily covered today you feel like might be important to leave our listeners with?
Yes, something that I'm always telling my clients is balance and not perfection. It can be very easy to become very overwhelmed with all of this. And remember that this is supposed to be a joyful process, and, you know, be really proud of the better choices that you are able to make, and be really kind to yourself through the process, and forgiving when, you know, you're not able to make your ideal choices.
Absolutely. And I feel like that's a really great lesson for everything that we do in our lives as well. I love that you said that. And I just want to finish off with a quote that I feel like I might have seen it on your Instagram page, because this was such another powerful thing that you said. It says, home designers and builders have a more significant role to play in the health and well-being of your family than the family doctor, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Your doctor cannot help you if your home is making you sick. A home that is designed and built with your health in mind is key to your family's ability to thrive.
Yep. This is a big one. And I've said it to the designers and builders that I've met, and yeah, it comes with a lot of responsibility that they really weren't aware of when they learned to become designers and builders.
100%. And I hope that, you know, conversations like this will start to get builders and just everyone, really, because you talked about the basic needs, you know, back at the start of the podcast about having shelter and home. Like, it does affect all of us, right? And so those are just really powerful words. So thank you for that. And also thank you so much for just all your sharing today and for being here with me. I think it's been really valuable, and people get a lot of insights for the tiny house space. So thanks so much, Zara, for being here.
Thank you for having me, and for all your great questions. I can tell you've done a lot of hard yards, which makes it a really interesting chat for everyone, hopefully. So thank you so much. I'm so grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thank you for saying that. I guess, you know, I said to you offline, I'm really passionate about bringing healthy homes and building biology into the tiny house world, because not enough people are talking about it, and there's not enough awareness around it. And I think that as the tiny house movement grows in Australia and around the world, we need to have these conversations, because what's more important than our health, you know, and we're spending a fair bit of time in our homes too. So I'm glad that we're able to kind of bring you into the tiny house space and all of that, and you know, just educate people and spread this message. So yeah, thanks again. And if you're listening to us at home, thank you so much for being here. As always, make sure you go check out everything that Zara is doing. And again, that link for the show notes is tinyhouseconversations.com. Make sure you stay tuned every Thursday for new episodes of the podcast, and I'll see you next week. Thanks again for listening. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, you found it valuable, and you want to support the podcast, the best way you can do that is to share the love. That way I can keep bringing you more tiny house conversations to help you on your own tiny journey. So here are 3 ways that you can support the podcast. Number 1, if you have a friend or family member that you feel would benefit from hearing these conversations, feel free to share it with them, email them, text them, send them a telegram, do whatever you need to do to share it with them. Number 2, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll know exactly when the next episode is live. And number 3, if you head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts and leave a 5-star rating and review. Thank you so much in advance. I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next episode.